The night was cold, and the streets were empty when Emperor IX slipped out of the palace through a servant's door. He wore the clothes of a traveling merchant, brown and plain, with a hood pulled low over his face. His guards did not know he had left. His advisors would have stopped him if they knew, but had grown tired of seeing his empire only through reports and numbers. He wanted to walk among his people and see the truth with his own eyes. The capital city looked different at street level. From his palace windows, the buildings seemed small and orderly, arranged in neat patterns that stretched to the horizon. Down here, the streets twisted and turned without logic. The buildings leaned against each other like tired old men. The air smelled of smoke and cooking oil and something else, something bitter that caught in his throat and made his eyes water. This was the smell of the failing atmospheric processors. His engineers had explained it to him many times. The great machines that cleaned the air and kept the city livable were breaking down. Parts wore out faster than they could be replaced. The systems were old, designed by engineers who had died centuries ago, and the knowledge to truly fix them had been lost. His council estimated that within 10 years, the lower districts would become unlivable. Within 20, the poison in the air would reach the palace itself. Walk deeper into the industrial district, where the smell grew worse. Here lived the workers who kept the empire running, the men and women who built things and fixed things and made things work. They could not afford to live in the cleaner upper districts, so they breathed the bad air every day and watched their children grow sick. A group of workers passed him, coming home from a late shift. They did not look at him. They were too tired to notice a stranger in plain clothes, watched them disappear into a building with cracked walls, and thought about how little he truly knew of their lives. It was past midnight when he found her shop. The building was small and squeezed between a closed tavern and what looked like an abandoned warehouse. A faded sign above the door read, "Repairs," in letters that had once been blue but had faded to gray. Most of the windows were dark, but one glowed with the warm light of an oil lamp. Stopped and looked through the window. He did not know why. Something about that single light in all the darkness drew his attention. Inside, he saw a woman. She was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair pulled back from her face and tied with a piece of string. She wore a leather apron covered in oil stains, and her hands were black with grease. She sat hunched over a workbench covered in papers and tools, and she was writing something in a small book with intense concentration. But it was not the woman herself that made stop breathing. It was what lay spread across her workbench. Even through the dirty window, he recognized the drawings. They were technical diagrams of atmospheric processors, the very machines that his best engineers had declared beyond saving. But these diagrams were different. They showed modifications, changes to the internal systems, additions that had never seen before. Arrows and notes covered every inch of the paper, and complex equations filled the margins. This was impossible. These technical documents were restricted to the highest levels of the Imperial Engineering Corps. A common mechanic in the lower districts should not possess them. More than that, she should not be able to understand them. The mathematics involved required years of formal education at the imperial academies. Yet here she was, studying them by lamplight, making notes, crossing out old ideas and writing new ones. Stood at the window for a long time, watching her work. She muttered to herself as she wrote, shaking her head at some ideas and nodding at others. Once, she crumpled a piece of paper and threw it across the room in frustration. A few minutes later, she retrieved it, smoothed it out, and began working on it again with fresh determination. Finally, she looked up and saw him watching. Expected her to be frightened. A strange man staring through her window in the middle of the night should have made her scream or reach for a weapon. Instead, she simply raised one eyebrow and met his gaze without fear. She stood up, walked to the door, and opened it. "Well," she said, her voice was clear and direct. "Does your timepiece need fixing, or do you plan to fog up my window all night? I have work to do." Up close could see the dark circles under her eyes. She had been working for many hours, perhaps many days. Her clothes were worn but clean, and despite her exhaustion, her eyes were sharp and intelligent. "My pocket watch," heard himself say. "It has been running slow." The woman stepped aside to let him in. The shop was cramped and cluttered, every surface covered with tools and parts and half-finished projects. But there was an order to the chaos, realized. Everything was exactly where she needed it to be. "Let me see it," she said, holding out her hand. Removed his pocket watch and gave it to her. It was a simple timepiece, nothing that would reveal his true identity. He had left his expensive imperial watch at the palace for exactly this reason. She examined it for only a few seconds before making a small sound of understanding. "The balance wheel is worn. I can fix it tonight if you want to wait, or you can come back tomorrow." "I will wait," said. The woman shrugged and sat down at a different workbench, this one covered in smaller tools meant for delicate work. She opened the watch with practiced ease and began examining its insides. Moved closer to her other workbench, pretending to look at the tools while actually studying the diagrams. His heart beat faster as he read the notes in the margins. The handwriting was messy, but the ideas were brilliant. "Those are not for customers to look at," the woman said without looking up from her work. "I apologize, I was curious. Are you designing something?" "Fixing something, or trying to," she glanced up briefly. "You would not understand." "Try me." The woman stopped working and looked at him properly for the first time. She studied his face, his clothes, his hands. Whatever she saw made her frown slightly. "You are not from this district," she said. It was not a question. "No." "Upper city?" "Yes." She nodded as if this confirmed something. "The atmospheric processors are failing. Everyone knows this. The engineers say there is nothing to be done, that the technology is too old, that the knowledge to fix them has been lost." She gestured at her diagrams. "They are wrong. The solution is not lost. It has simply been overlooked because the people who could find it were never allowed to look." Mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the Imperial Academies only accept students from wealthy families. I mean that the engineering corps only promotes men with the right connections. I mean that somewhere in this empire, there might be a dozen people who could solve this problem, but they are all cleaning floors or fixing pocket watches because no one thought to give them a chance." She spoke without anger, just stating facts. This made her words hit even harder. "And you," asked, "you think you can solve it?" "I know I can. Or I could if I had access to the processors themselves and materials to test my ideas, and time that I did not have to spend fixing rich men's watches to pay for food." She returned to her work. "But that will never happen, so I study at night and dream of better worlds." "Where did you learn all this? The mathematics, the engineering?" "Books, old textbooks that the academies threw away. Technical manuals that I found in junk shops. I taught myself." She paused. "Do you know what it is like to understand something that no one will let you use, to see a solution clearly and be unable to reach it?" Did not answer. He was thinking about all the meetings he had attended, all the reports he had read, all the experts who had told him that nothing could be done. None of them had mentioned looking in a mechanic's shop on a forgotten street in the lower districts. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lyra, what is yours?" "Well," she held up his watch, now ticking smoothly. "That will be 3 copper pieces." He gave her a silver coin instead, far more than the work was worth. She looked at it with suspicion but did not refuse it. "Thank you, Lyra," he said as he moved toward the door, "for fixing my watch, and for the conversation. Thank you for paying too much." She was already turning back to her diagrams. "Close the door on your way out. The cold air makes my lamp flicker." Walked back through the dark streets toward his palace, his mind spinning with everything he had seen and heard. The solution to his empire's greatest crisis might have been found by a woman who taught herself engineering from discarded textbooks. A woman who would never be given a chance because she had been born in the wrong district, to the wrong family, with the wrong name. He thought about her working by lamplight, night after night, dreaming of a future she believed she would never reach. He thought about the millions of people in the lower districts who were slowly being poisoned by air that no one could clean. He thought about his council of experts who had told him nothing could be done. When he finally reached his chambers, the emperor did not sleep. He sat at his desk and began writing orders, his hand moving faster than his thoughts. By morning, he had a plan. He would return to Lyra's shop, and this time he would not lie about who he was. Lyra did not think about the strange merchant again. Men like him came through her shop sometimes, slumming in the lower districts for adventure or looking for cheap repairs. They were too embarrassed to request from respectable shops. They paid well, asked too many questions, and never returned. She had learned not to remember their faces. So when a week passed without any sign of him, she was not surprised. She continued her work during the day, fixing watches and small machines for customers who could barely afford her prices. At night, she studied her diagrams and dreamed her impossible dreams. The knock came just after sunset on the seventh day. She opened the door expecting a customer. Instead, she found 4 men in Imperial Guard uniforms standing in her narrow street. Behind them stood the merchant from before, but he had changed his clothes. Now he wore robes of deep blue silk, trimmed with gold thread that caught the light of the street lamps. Lyra felt her heart stop. "May I come in?" the emperor asked. She stepped back without speaking. Her mind was racing through every law she might have broken, the restricted documents, the forbidden technical manuals, teaching herself engineering without a license. Any of these could mean prison. All of them together could mean death. The emperor entered alone, leaving his guards outside. He looked around her small shop with the same curiosity he had shown before, touching nothing, studying everything. "I have not come to arrest you," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "I have come to make you an offer." "What kind of offer?" He turned to face her. Up close, without his hood, she could see that he was younger than she had expected. Perhaps 30, with tired eyes and the kind of face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. "Your diagrams," he said. "Your modifications to the atmospheric processors, do they work?" "I believe they do. I cannot be certain without testing them." "What would you need to be certain?" Lyra laughed before she could stop herself. "What would I need? Access to a working processor, materials to build the modifications, a team of skilled workers, months of time and thousands of gold pieces." She shook her head. "Things I will never have." "What if you could have them?" The laughter died in her throat. She stared at him, searching for the joke, the trick, the hidden cruelty. She found nothing but sincerity. "You are serious?" "The atmospheric processors are failing. My engineers tell me nothing can be done. You tell me they are wrong." He spread his hands. "I am willing to find out which of you is right." "Your engineers will never accept this. They will never accept me." "They will accept what I tell them to accept. And if I fail, if my ideas do not work, then we will have tried and we will know for certain and I will be no worse off than I am now." He paused. "But if you succeed, you will save millions of lives, including mine." Lyra sat down heavily on her workbench. Her hands were shaking. She had dreamed of this moment for years, imagined it so many times that it had become a fantasy, a story she told herself to survive the endless nights of study. Now it was real, and she did not know what to say. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you do this? You do not know me. You have no reason to trust my ideas." The emperor was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before. "I walked through the lower districts that night because I was tired of seeing my empire through reports. I wanted to see the truth." He met her eyes. "I saw you studying by lamplight, teaching yourself things that my engineers spent decades learning at the finest academies. I saw you working alone in the dark, trying to solve a problem that will kill thousands of your neighbors. And I thought, if she has accomplished this much with nothing, what could she accomplish with everything? He reached into his robes and removed a folded document sealed with the imperial mark. This is a letter of patronage. It grants you access to the imperial engineering workshops, the palace libraries, and any materials you require. It also grants you protection from anyone who might try to stop your work. He held it out to her. You can take this and try to save your city, or you can stay here and fix pocket watches until the air becomes too poisonous to breathe. The choice is yours. Lyra looked at the document in his hand. It represented everything she had ever wanted, everything she had believed was impossible. It also represented danger, scrutiny, and almost certain failure. The imperial court would never accept a woman from the lower districts. The engineers would never respect her ideas. She would be surrounded by enemies who wanted her to fail. But she thought about her neighbors, the children who coughed all winter, the old men who could barely breathe. She thought about the streets that smelled of poison and the sky that had not been truly clear in her lifetime. She thought about all the nights she had spent studying alone, dreaming of a chance to prove that her ideas could work. She took the document. "I will try," she said. "I cannot promise I will succeed, but I will try." The emperor smiled, and for a moment he looked like a different person, younger and lighter and full of hope. "That is all I ask." The imperial palace was like another world. Lyra had never been inside any building larger than the district warehouse. Now she walked through halls that seemed to stretch forever, past windows of colored glass and statues of ancient heroes, surrounded by servants in fine clothes who looked at her with barely hidden contempt. The emperor had given her rooms in the palace itself, saying it would be easier for her to work if she lived close to the workshops. The rooms were bigger than her entire shop. The bed was softer than anything she had ever touched. The bathroom had running hot water, a luxury she had only heard about in stories. But the true wonder was the workshop. The Imperial Engineering Workshop took up an entire wing of the palace. It contained machines Lyra had only read about, tools she had only imagined, materials she had never dared to dream of using. For the first hour, she simply walked through it, touching everything, trying to convince herself it was real. The engineers found her there. There were 5 of them, all men, all dressed in the formal robes of the Imperial Engineering Corps. Their leader was a tall man with gray hair and cold eyes named Master. He had served 3 emperors and designed half the machines in the capital city. He was also, Lyra realized immediately, her enemy. "So," he said, looking her up and down as if examining a bug, "this is the mechanic who thinks she can succeed where we have failed." "I do not think I can succeed where you have failed," Lyra said carefully. "I think I can succeed where you stop trying." The silence that followed was heavy with anger. Master's face turned red, and the other engineers shifted uncomfortably. "You know nothing of our work," Master said. "You have no formal training, no credentials, no understanding of proper procedures. You are a shop girl who learned to read technical manuals. That does not make you an engineer." "You are right," Lyra agreed. "I am not an engineer. I am a mechanic. We fix things that are broken. Sometimes that requires forgetting everything we think we know and looking at the problem with fresh eyes." "Fresh eyes," Master spat the words. "The atmospheric processors are the most complex machines in the Empire. They require a lifetime of study to understand." "Then perhaps you have studied them too long. Perhaps you have looked at them so many times that you cannot see them anymore." Lyra pulled her worn notebook from her pocket. "I have ideas. They may be wrong, but I would like the chance to test them." "The Emperor has ordered us to cooperate with you," Master said. "So we will cooperate. We will give you access to the workshops and the materials you request. But know this, shop girl, when you fail, and you will fail, I will personally escort you back to the lower districts where you belong." He turned and walked away, and his engineers followed. Lyra watched them go. Her hands were steady, but her heart was racing. She had expected this. She had prepared herself for this, but expecting hatred and experiencing it were different things. She looked down at her notebook, at the diagrams and equations that had kept her company through so many lonely nights. Then she looked at the vast workshop around her, filled with tools and machines and possibilities. She had work to do. The first months were the hardest. Everything took longer than it should have. When Lyra requested materials, they arrived late or damaged or wrong. When she submitted designs for review, they sat on desks for weeks before being returned with vague criticisms. When she tried to access the atmospheric processors themselves, she was told that permission was being processed and she should wait. She knew what was happening. The engineers were following the Emperor's orders to cooperate, but they were doing everything possible to slow her down and make her fail. They hoped she would give up and go home. They underestimated how stubborn she could be. Lyra worked 18 hours a day. She built small models of her modifications using scrap materials she found in forgotten corners of the workshop. She ran calculations until her hands cramped and her eyes blurred. She asked questions of anyone who would answer, learning the layout of the palace, the schedules of the guards, the secrets that servants whispered to each other in hallways. And slowly, piece by piece, she began to make progress. Her breakthrough came 3 months after her arrival, on a night when she had been working so long that she had forgotten to eat. She was running through her equations for the 100th time, looking for the error that had to be there, when suddenly she saw it. Not an error, but a connection she had missed. 2 separate systems that should work together but never had because no one had thought to link them. She spent the rest of the night building a new model. When morning came, she tested it in the workshop while the engineers were still asleep. The results were better than she had hoped. Her modification increased processing efficiency by 40%. It used half the materials of the current system. It was simple enough that ordinary workers could maintain it without specialized training, and it could be installed in existing processors without shutting them down. Lyra documented everything carefully. Then she went to find Master. He was in his office, surrounded by papers and looking pleased with himself. When she entered, his expression changed to annoyance. "What do you want, shop girl? I am busy. I want you to come to the workshop. I have something to show you. I do not have time for your amateur experiments." Lyra put her documentation on his desk. "Read this, or do not read it, and explain to the Emperor why you ignored a solution to the atmospheric crisis." She turned and walked out before he could respond. An hour later, Master came to the workshop. He brought all of his engineers with him, clearly expecting to expose Lyra's failure and humiliate her in front of witnesses. Instead, he watched in silence as she demonstrated her modification. When she finished, no one spoke for a long moment. Then one of the younger engineers stepped forward. His name was Tobias, and he had been kinder to Lyra than the others, though not by much. "This is remarkable," he said quietly. "The efficiency gains alone would change everything, and the simplicity of the design." He shook his head in wonder. "How did you think of this?" "I did not think of it," Lyra said. "I saw it. When you have studied something long enough, you stop seeing what is there and start seeing what you expect. I had no expectations, so I saw what was actually in front of me." Master's face had gone through several colors during the demonstration. Now it settled on a shade of purple that suggested barely controlled rage. "This proves nothing," he said. "A workshop model is not a working processor. Your modification might fail completely when applied to a real machine." "Then let us apply it to a real machine and find out." "Impossible. The processors are too important to risk on untested ideas." "The processors are failing anyway. What do we have to lose?" Before Master could respond, a new voice spoke from the doorway. "The lady makes an excellent point." Everyone turned. Emperor stood at the entrance to the workshop, dressed simply, with no guards in sight. He must have entered quietly while they were focused on the demonstration. "Your Majesty," Master said, bowing deeply, "I was not aware you were observing." "I was not observing, I was listening." The Emperor walked forward and picked up Lyra's documentation. He read through it quickly, his eyes scanning the equations and diagrams with obvious understanding. "This is impressive work. Master, why have I not been informed of this progress?" "The modification has not been properly tested, Your Majesty. I did not wish to raise false hope." "I see." The Emperor set down the papers. "Well, now we will test it properly. Lady, choose a processor. You have my permission to install your modification and demonstrate its effectiveness." "Your Majesty," Master protested, "the risk is mine to take." The Emperor's voice was quiet but firm. "Prepare the test. I will observe personally." He met Lyra's eyes and gave her a small nod before leaving. Master stared after him with an expression of pure hatred, then turned that hatred toward Lyra. "Very well, shop girl. You will have your test, and when you fail, there will be no Emperor to protect you from the consequences." He swept out of the workshop, his engineers following. Only Tobias lingered, looking at Lyra with something like respect. "For what it is worth," he said quietly, "I hope you succeed." Then he too was gone, and Lyra was alone in the workshop with her models and her documentation, and the weight of an empire on her shoulders. The test was scheduled for the following week. Lyra spent every day preparing, checking her calculations, building the full-size components, running through every possible scenario. The engineers cooperated more fully now, perhaps because the Emperor was watching or perhaps because some of them were beginning to believe in her ideas. The night before the test, Lyra could not sleep. She walked through the palace gardens in the dark, breathing the bitter air and looking at the stars she could barely see through the haze. Tomorrow, everything would change. Either she would prove that her ideas worked, or she would fail publicly and spectacularly and lose everything she had gained. "You should be resting." She turned. The Emperor stood behind her, dressed in simple clothes, looking as tired as she felt. "So should you, Your Majesty." "I have not been able to sleep properly since my father died." He moved to stand beside her, looking up at the clouded sky. "He used to tell me that the stars were brighter when he was young, that you could see them clearly from the palace roof. I have never seen that. I have never known air that did not taste of poison. Perhaps tomorrow that will begin to change." "Perhaps." He was quiet for a moment. "I have been thinking about the night I found you, walking through the lower districts looking for truth. I did not expect to find it in a mechanic's shop. I did not expect to find it there either. I expected to live my whole life fixing watches and dreaming of impossibilities. And now?" Lyra considered the question. "Now I am still dreaming of impossibilities, but I am closer to them than I ever thought I could be." The Emperor turned to look at her. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that I do not regret this decision, even if the test fails, even if the engineers were right and I was a fool for believing in you. It was worth trying. It was worth giving you this chance. I will not fail." "You cannot know that." "No," Lyra met his eyes. "But I know that I have worked harder for this than I have ever worked for anything. I know that my calculations are correct, and I know that sometimes the impossible is only impossible until someone does it." The Emperor smiled slightly. "You sound very certain for someone who was fixing pocket watches a few months ago." "I was never just fixing pocket watches, Your Majesty. I was waiting for this chance. Now that I have it, I will not waste it." They stood in silence for a while, watching the clouded sky and breathing the poisoned air. Then the Emperor nodded once and turned to leave. "Good luck tomorrow, Lyra. The Empire is watching." "I know," Lyra said. "That is why I will succeed." The next morning, she went to the processor station and began the work that would change everything. The test was a success. Lyra's modification worked exactly as her calculations had predicted. Processing efficiency increased by 43%, 3 points better than her model had suggested. The air coming out of the modified processor was cleaner than it had been in decades. The workers who operated the machine reported that it ran more smoothly and required less maintenance. Master stood in silence as the results were announced. His face was blank, but his hands were shaking slightly. When the Emperor asked for his assessment, he said only, "The results speak for themselves, Your Majesty." Then he walked away, and 3 days later he submitted his resignation. He had served the Empire for 40 years, he wrote, and it was time for new ideas and new leadership. No one believed this explanation, but no one questioned it either. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. The Emperor ordered Lyra's modification installed in every atmospheric processor in the capital city. Other engineers, freed from Master's influence, began working with her instead of against her. Tobias became her chief assistant, and together they trained teams of workers to maintain the new systems. The improvement was immediate and visible. Within a month, the air in the lower districts was noticeably cleaner. Within 3 months, the bitter smell that Lyra had known her whole life began to fade. People looked up at the sky and saw colors they had never seen before, blue so bright it hurt their eyes after a lifetime of gray. But Lyra did not celebrate. She was already thinking about the next step. The capital city was only the beginning. The empire stretched across thousands of miles, with hundreds of processor stations scattered throughout. Most of them were in worse condition than the capital's machines. Many were in districts so remote that engineers never visited them. To truly solve the atmospheric crisis, every single processor would need to be modified and maintained. It would take years, maybe decades, but Lyra had been waiting her whole life for this chance. She was not going to stop now. She requested a meeting with the Emperor and presented her plan. A training program for workers in every district, a network of communication to share knowledge and report problems, standardized designs that could be built with local materials, a complete transformation of how the Empire approached atmospheric processing. The Emperor listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "This will be expensive," he said finally. "Yes, and difficult. My council will resist. They will say it cannot be done, that it costs too much, that there are other priorities." They will be wrong. They were wrong before. The Emperor stood and walked to his window, looking out at the city below. "Do you know what I have learned from all of this, Lyra? I have learned that the experts are not always right, that the impossible is not always impossible, that sometimes the solution to our greatest problems is found not in palaces, but in small shops where brilliant people work by lamplight because no one gave them a chance." He turned back to face her. "You will have everything you need. Whatever it costs, whatever resistance we face, we will do this. Because if we do not, everything we have accomplished so far will be meaningless. The capital will breathe clean air while the rest of the empire chokes. That is not acceptable." "Thank you, Your Majesty." "Do not thank me yet. We have only begun. The real work is still ahead." Lyra nodded. She had known this from the start. Success was not a destination but a direction. Every problem solved revealed new problems. Every achievement created new responsibilities. But she was ready. She had always been ready. She had just been waiting for the world to catch up. Over the next 10 years, Lyra transformed an empire. She traveled to every district, every processing station, every forgotten corner of the realm. She trained thousands of workers, supervised hundreds of installations, solved countless problems that arose along the way. She wrote manuals that explained complex systems in simple words. She designed tools that ordinary people could use without specialized training. She built a network of engineers and mechanics and workers who shared her vision and carried it forward. There were setbacks. Some modifications failed and had to be redesigned. Some workers were corrupt or incompetent and had to be replaced. Some districts were so damaged that no amount of clean air could save them, and their people had to be relocated to new homes. Lyra learned to accept these failures without letting them stop her. And there were enemies, powerful families who had profited from the old systems and resented the change. Jealous engineers who spread rumors about her methods and her relationship with the Emperor. Religious leaders who claimed the atmospheric crisis was divine punishment and that fixing it was sinful. Lyra learned to navigate these obstacles without being destroyed by them. The assassination attempt came in the 6th year, on a night when Lyra was working late in the palace workshop. She had just completed the final designs for the last phase of modifications, the plans that would bring clean air to even the most remote districts. She was exhausted and triumphant and completely focused on her work. The guard who brought her evening tea was named. He had been assigned to her security detail for 2 years and had never seemed like anything other than a loyal servant. She had no reason to suspect him. She did not even look up when he placed the cup on her desk. "Thank you, you may go." "Yes, my lady." He left and she continued working. The tea grew cold beside her, forgotten. When Emperor found her the next morning, she was still at her desk, surrounded by papers and diagrams and calculations. The cold tea sat untouched at her elbow, and she looked up with bleary eyes when he entered. "I finished," she said, holding up her designs. "Every processor in the Empire. Within 5 years, the air will be clean everywhere. Will see stars we cannot even imagine." The Emperor did not answer. He was staring at the cup of tea. "Your Majesty." He picked up the cup and smelled it carefully. His face went pale. "This tea is poisoned," he said quietly. "If you had drunk it, you would be dead." Lyra looked at the cup, at the cold brown liquid that she had been too busy to drink, at the thing that should have killed her. "Oh," she said. The investigation was swift and thorough. Confessed within hours, revealing a conspiracy that reached into some of the highest families in the Empire. They had paid him to poison her, hoping that without Lyra, the atmospheric restoration project would collapse and they could return to the old ways that had made them rich. The Emperor showed no mercy. The conspirators were arrested, tried, and executed. Their families were stripped of their titles and their wealth was distributed to the lower districts. Was imprisoned for life in the deepest dungeon in the Empire. When Lyra asked for clemency for the plotters, arguing that they were only frightened men protecting their interests, the Emperor refused. "They tried to kill you," he said. "They tried to kill the future. They tried to murder the hope of millions of people so they could continue profiting from their suffering. Some crimes cannot be forgiven." Lyra did not argue further. She understood his reasoning even if she could not fully share his anger. The conspirators had not tried to kill her because they hated her personally. They had tried to kill her because she represented change, and change threatened everything they knew. But understanding did not mean accepting. And the Emperor was right about one thing. Some acts were too dangerous to go unpunished. If others believed they could stop the restoration project through violence, they would try again. The executions sent a message that the Emperor hoped would never need to be repeated. The final phase of the atmospheric restoration took 4 more years. Lyra oversaw every installation personally, traveling to the farthest corners of the Empire, working alongside the local teams she had trained. She grew older and more tired, her hair beginning to gray, her hands stiff from decades of labor. But she never stopped, because stopping meant admitting that the work was finished, and she was not sure she would know how to live in a world where she was not needed. On the night the last processor came online, she stood on the roof of her old shop on street and watched the stars emerge through air cleaner than it had been in a century. The buildings around her were still poor, still crowded, still home to the workers who kept the empire running. But the bitter smell was gone. The children did not cough anymore. And the sky, for the first time in living memory, was full of light. The Emperor found her there hours later, having tracked her down through the capital city without guards or attendants. He had given up pretending his visits were merely political long ago. They had become something else, something neither of them named but both of them understood. "You could have been anything," he said, standing beside her on the roof. "With a mind like yours, you could have ruled." Lyra smiled at the stars she had helped reveal. They were brighter than she had ever imagined, scattered across a sky of deepest black, beautiful beyond description. "I could have," she agreed, "but someone needed to fix the machines, and I have always preferred useful to powerful." The Emperor laughed softly. It was a sound she had heard only a handful of times in all the years they had known each other. He was not a man who laughed easily. "That is the most human lesson anyone has ever taught me," he said, "and I think it may be the most important." "What lesson?" "That greatness is not found in palaces, that titles do not make a person worthy, that the most valuable people in an empire might be working in forgotten shops, studying by lamplight, dreaming of futures they believe they will never reach." He turned to face her. "You have shown me a different way of seeing the world, Lyra, and I will carry that with me for the rest of my life." Lyra did not know what to say. She had never been good with words, with the kind of speeches that nobles made to each other in the grand halls of the palace. She was a mechanic. She fixed things that were broken. Words were not her tools. But she reached out and took his hand, and they stood together on the roof of her old shop, watching the stars that she had helped to reveal, breathing the air that she had cleaned, surrounded by the empire that she had saved. "Thank you," she said finally, "for coming to my window that night, for giving me a chance when no one else would, for believing in me when I was not sure I believed in myself. Thank you for being worthy of that belief." They stayed on the roof until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Then Lyra went back inside to her old workbench, and the Emperor returned to his palace, and the empire continued turning around them, cleaner and brighter and more hopeful than it had been in centuries. History would remember Lyra as the woman who saved an empire. They would write books about her and build statues in her honor and teach her story to children in schools across the realm. She became a legend, a symbol, an inspiration for generations of young people who dreamed of changing the world. But Lyra herself preferred a simpler truth. She was a mechanic who had seen a problem and fixed it. The fact that the problem happened to be apocalyptic seemed, to her, beside the point. What mattered was the work. What mattered was seeing something broken and making it whole again. What mattered was leaving the world a little better than she had found it. And in the end, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. She lived for another 30 years after the final processor came online. She never stopped working, never stopped teaching, never stopped looking for problems to solve. When younger engineers asked her for advice, she told them the same thing every time. Learn everything you can, question everything you know, and never stop believing that the impossible is possible. When she finally died, peacefully in her sleep in the rooms above her old shop, the Emperor declared a week of mourning throughout the empire. People gathered in the streets to remember her, lighting candles and telling stories about the mechanic who had saved them all. But the greatest tribute came from the sky itself. On the night of her funeral, the stars shone brighter than they had in centuries, clear and brilliant and beautiful, a testament to everything she had accomplished. Children pointed up at them in wonder, and their parents told them the story of Lyra, the woman who had studied by lamplight and dreamed of a better world. It was the most human lesson an empire had ever learned. That greatness was not found in palaces but in persistence, not in titles but in work done well, not in the light of crowns but in the steady glow of a lamp where a woman sat studying, night after night, reaching for a future she alone could see. And in the end, she had reached it.